car is this? There's no way you own a Lamborghini like this. Tell me how you got it.
It's mine, officer. I already showed you my license and registration.
Yeah, that license doesn't prove a thing. Either you let me search the vehicle or you're going in cuffs.
Chief Dominic Shaw, the newly appointed police chief who had been hired specifically to reform a department with a documented history of racial profiling, spent his third day on the job driving a Lamborghini Urus through the districts where complaints were highest, see which officers would stop him based solely on the color of his skin and the car he was driving. Officer Eric Holloway, a 7-year veteran with 2 prior complaints about racially motivated stops that had been dismissed, saw the Lamborghini driven by a black man and immediately pulled him over and demanded the driver's license, registration, and proof of ownership because in his mind there was no way a black man could legitimately afford a $250,000 luxury SUV. When Shaw asked why he had been stopped, Holloway ignored him and told him to step out of the vehicle, and when Shaw refused and stated his rights were being violated, Holloway barked that if he didn't step out immediately he would be arrested, and when Shaw asked, "Arrested for what?" Holloway snapped, "I'm the one in charge here asking the question, so step out or get arrested. Your choice." Officer Eric Holloway didn't know, and what he was about to discover in the most devastating way was that the black man he had just profiled and illegally searched was the new chief of police, that the stop had been a deliberate test of officers' adherence to constitutional standards, and that his failure had been documented, recorded, and would result in his immediate termination. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. And if you believe driving an expensive car while black isn't a crime and shouldn't be treated as suspicious, like this video and subscribe. The city of Parkdale had been dealing with the same problem for years and everyone knew it. The police department had been the subject of 3 separate investigations by the Department of Justice, all of them focused on the same issue. A documented pattern of racial profiling that had resulted in hundreds of complaints from black and Latino residents who claimed they had been stopped, questioned, and searched without any legal justification. The complaints had been filed, reviewed, and in most cases dismissed with minimal consequences for the officers involved. The community had been asking for reform for years, and the city council had finally responded by bringing in someone from outside the department to clean it up. Chief Dominic Shaw was 45 years old with 22 years in law enforcement, and he had built a reputation as a reformer who didn't tolerate officers who ignored the Constitution. He had worked his way up from patrol officer to detective to captain in a neighboring city's department, and over the years he had earned respect for being fair, transparent, and willing to hold officers accountable when they crossed the line. When the mayor of Parkdale called him and offered him the position of police chief with a clear mandate to identify and remove officers who engaged in racial profiling, Shaw had accepted immediately. He knew what he was walking into. He had reviewed the complaint data, he had read the DOJ reports, and he knew that words and policies wouldn't be enough. He needed to see for himself which officers would follow the law and which ones would let their biases override their training. Shaw had been on the job for 3 days, and he had spent those 3 days doing something that most police chiefs would never do. He had been driving his personal vehicle, a pearl white Lamborghini Urus that he had purchased 2 years earlier with money he had saved over 2 decades of working overtime inside security jobs, through the districts where racial profiling complaints were highest. He dressed in casual business clothes, drove the speed limit, obeyed every traffic law, and waited to see which officers would pull him over based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the car he was driving. On the first day, he had been stopped once by an officer who approached politely, asked for his license and registration, and when Shaw asked why he had been stopped, the officer admitted he didn't have a specific violation, but thought the car looked out of place in the neighborhood. When Shaw identified himself as the new police chief, the officer had apologized immediately and let him go. Shaw made a note of the officer's name, but didn't discipline him because the officer had been honest and hadn't violated Shaw's rights. On the second day, he had been stopped again by a different officer who asked similar questions but backed off the moment Shaw explained he was the new chief and was testing department protocols. That officer also received a note in his file but no formal discipline. On the third day, Shaw was driving through District 7, one of the areas with the highest number of complaints, when he saw the patrol car in his rearview mirror. Officer Eric Holloway had been working District 7 for the past 4 years, and over those 4 years he had developed a reputation that his supervisors had documented but never seriously addressed. Holloway was 33 years old with 7 years on the force, and he had been the subject of 2 formal complaints from black drivers who claimed he had pulled them over without cause, demanded proof of ownership for their vehicles, and searched their cars without consent. The first complaint had come from a black doctor driving a BMW who had been stopped and accused of driving a stolen vehicle despite showing registration and proof of insurance. The second complaint had come from a black business owner in a Mercedes who Holloway had detained for 45 minutes while running repeated checks on the vehicle and the driver, all based on nothing more than the assumption that a black man couldn't afford an expensive car. Both complaints had been investigated and dismissed with verbal warnings. Holloway's file showed a pattern, but the pattern had been ignored. That afternoon, Holloway was on patrol when he saw the Lamborghini Urus driving through his district. The SUV was moving at exactly the speed limit, staying in its lane, obeying every traffic signal. There was no erratic driving, no equipment violations, nothing that would constitute a legal reason to initiate a traffic stop. But Holloway saw a black man behind the wheel of a $250,000 luxury vehicle, and his instincts, shaped by years of operating on assumptions rather than evidence, told him something was wrong. Holloway activated his lights and pulled the Lamborghini over. Shaw saw the lights in his rearview mirror and felt a familiar mix of frustration and determination. This was exactly what he had been testing for. He pulled over to the side of the road, put the vehicle in park, and waited with his hands visible on the steering wheel. Holloway got out of his patrol car and approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his service weapon, a posture designed to communicate authority and potential threat. He stopped at the window and looked at Shaw, and the first words out of his mouth weren't a greeting or an explanation. They were a demand. License, registration, and proof of ownership, now. Shaw looked up at Holloway, his expression calm, but his voice carrying a deliberate precision. "Officer, can you tell me why you pulled me over?" Holloway didn't answer the question. He just repeated the demand, his tone sharper. "License, registration, and proof of ownership. Let me see them." Shaw reached slowly into the center console and pulled out his wallet, his registration, and his insurance card. He handed them through the window to Holloway, who took them and examined them carefully. The driver's license showed the name Dominic Shaw, but Holloway didn't recognize it. He had been told in roll call 3 days ago that there was a new police chief, but he hadn't been paying attention to the name, and he certainly hadn't been shown a photo. Holloway looked at the registration, which showed the Lamborghini was registered to Dominic Shaw at an address in the neighboring city. He looked back at Shaw. "This your car?" Shaw's voice stayed calm. "Yes, as you can see from the registration, it's in my name." Holloway's tone turned more suspicious. "How'd you afford a car like this?" Shaw's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not a legal question, officer. Is there a specific violation you observed that justified this stop?" Holloway didn't like the pushback. In his experience, people who questioned him were people who had something to hide. "You're driving through this neighborhood in an expensive car. That's reason enough for me to check things out." Shaw's voice stayed level, but there was an edge to it now. Driving through a neighborhood is not illegal, and driving an expensive car is not probable cause for a stop. So I'll ask you again. What specific traffic violation did I commit? Holloway's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people questioning his authority, and he didn't like it. "Step out of the vehicle." Shaw didn't move. "I'm not stepping out unless you can provide a legal reason for this stop. You pulled me over without cause, and now you're demanding I exit my vehicle. That's a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." Holloway's voice got louder, more aggressive. "If you don't step out of this vehicle right now, you're going to be arrested." Shaw looked at him directly. "Arrested for what?" Holloway leaned closer to the window, his voice cold and certain. "I'm the one in charge here asking the questions. So step out or get arrested. Your choice." Shaw held Holloway's gaze for a long moment, and then he made a decision. He could continue to refuse and force Holloway to either back down or escalate to physical force, but Shaw wanted to see how far Holloway would go. He wanted the full extent of this officer's willingness to violate rights, documented on camera. Shaw opened the door and stepped out of the Lamborghini, his movements slow and deliberate, his hands visible at all times. As he stood on the side of the road, he spoke clearly and loudly enough that Holloway's Bodycam would pick up every word. "For the record, I am stepping out of this vehicle under protest. I have not committed any traffic violation. I have not consented to this stop, and I am clearly stating that I do not consent to any search of my person or my vehicle." Holloway ignored him. "Put your hands on the hood." Shaw complied, placing his hands on the hood of the Lamborghini while Holloway patted him down. Finding nothing, Holloway stepped back and looked at the SUV. "I'm going to search your vehicle." Shaw's voice was firm. "I do not consent to a search. You have no probable cause." Holloway smirked. "I've got plenty of cause, expensive car, suspicious behavior, that's enough." Shaw shook his head. Neither of those things constitute probable cause under the Fourth Amendment. I am clearly and explicitly stating that I do not consent to any search. Holloway walked to the passenger side of the Lamborghini and opened the door anyway. He searched the glove compartment, the center console, under the seats. He found nothing. Then he walked to the back of the vehicle and popped the trunk. Inside the trunk was a black leather briefcase, a gym bag, and nothing else. Holloway pulled the briefcase toward him and opened it without hesitation, ignoring the fact that searching a closed container without consent or a warrant was yet another constitutional violation. The briefcase contained several documents with the official Parkdale Police Department seal at the top. Holloway picked up the first document and started reading. Termination notice. Officer name, Eric Holloway. Badge number, 4127. Reason for termination. Violation of Fourth Amendment rights, conducting unlawful stop and search. Racial profiling. Pattern of dismissed complaints. Indicating bias-based policing. Effective date. Today's date. Signed, Chief Dominic Shaw. Holloway stared at the document. He read it once, then read it again. His hands started shaking. He looked at the signature at the bottom, then looked up at Shaw standing beside the Lamborghini. His face went pale and his mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked back down at the document, then up at Shaw again, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He was questioning his own reality, not wanting to believe what his eyes were seeing. "You're..." Holloway's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You're the chief." Shaw's expression didn't change. His voice was calm, cold, and final. "Yes, I'm Chief Dominic Shaw, and you just failed the test." Officer Eric Holloway stood at the back of the Lamborghini Urus, holding his own termination letter in his shaking hands, and the reality of what he had just done was crashing down on him with a weight that made it hard to breathe. He looked at Chief Dominic Shaw, then back at the document, then at Shaw again, his brain still trying to process how this could be happening. "Sir, I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job. I thought..." Shaw cut him off, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made Holloway go silent immediately. "You thought what, Officer Holloway? You thought that a black man driving an expensive car must have stolen it? You thought that driving through a neighborhood was probable cause for a stop? You thought that refusing consent to a search meant you could search anyway?" Holloway tried to find words that would make this situation salvageable, but everything that came to mind sounded like an excuse. "The car looked out of place. I was being cautious. I've made stops like this before and found..." "Found what?" Shaw interrupted again. "Let me guess. You've stopped other black men in expensive cars, demanded proof of ownership, searched their vehicles without consent, and most of the time you found nothing. But you kept doing it anyway because in your mind, a black man with money must be a criminal." Holloway's face flushed. "That's not what I was thinking." Shaw reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had been recording audio from the moment Holloway had approached his window, and the entire interaction was captured. "I have you on recording demanding my license, registration, and proof of ownership without stating a reason for the stop. I have you threatening to arrest me when I asked what I was being arrested for. I have you searching my vehicle after I explicitly stated I did not consent. All of that is documented." Holloway looked at the phone, and the last bit of hope that he might be able to explain his way out of this situation disappeared. "Sir, please, I have a family. I've been on the force for 7 years. I made a mistake, but..." Shaw's expression didn't soften. "This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. I reviewed your personnel file before I took this job. You've had 2 formal complaints in the past 4 years, both from black men driving expensive cars. Both involved the same behavior you just demonstrated with me. Both complaints were dismissed with verbal warnings, and you kept doing it because no one had ever held you accountable." Holloway's voice got desperate. "Those complaints were investigated. They cleared me." "Cleared you doesn't mean you were right," Shaw said. "It means the department didn't want to deal with the problem. But I'm not that kind of chief. I told the mayor I would clean up this department, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Shaw took the termination letter from Holloway's hands and placed it back in the briefcase. Then he pulled out his radio and called for a supervisor. "This is Chief Shaw. I need a sergeant to respond to my location immediately. I have an officer who just conducted an unlawful stop and search, and I'm relieving him of duty." The dispatcher's voice came back confused. "Chief Shaw, can you repeat that?" "You heard me correctly. Send a supervisor to my location, now." Holloway stood there frozen, still trying to process what was happening. "You're firing me right here, on the side of the road?" Shaw looked at him with an expression that showed no sympathy. "You violated my constitutional rights. You conducted an illegal search. You threatened to arrest me for asserting my rights. And you did all of it because you saw a black man in an expensive car and assumed I was a criminal. Yes, Officer Holloway, I'm firing you right here. Within 5 minutes, a police cruiser pulled up behind Holloway's patrol car. Sergeant Maria Torres stepped out, and the moment she saw Chief Shaw standing next to the Lamborghini, her expression shifted from confusion to concern. Chief Shaw, what's going on? Shaw gestured toward Holloway. Officer Holloway just pulled me over without cause, demanded proof of ownership for my vehicle, threatened to arrest me when I refused to step out, and then searched my car after I explicitly stated I did not consent. His body cam has the entire interaction recorded. I want him off the street immediately. Torres looked at Holloway and her face showed that she understood exactly how serious this was. Officer Holloway, is that true? Holloway opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing came out that would make the situation better. I didn't know he was the chief. Torres shook her head. That doesn't matter. Did you have probable cause for the stop? Holloway hesitated. He was driving an expensive car in this neighborhood. It looked suspicious. Torres closed her eyes for a moment like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she looked at Shaw. Sir, I'm sorry. This is unacceptable. Shaw nodded. Officer Holloway is suspended effective immediately. I want his badge, his weapon, and his body cam secured as evidence. He's not to return to duty pending the outcome of a formal investigation. Torres turned to Holloway. Badge and weapon, now. Holloway's hands were still shaking as he unclipped his badge from his uniform and handed it to Torres. Then he unholstered his service weapon, cleared it, and handed that over as well. The look on his face was a mixture of shock, humiliation, and the slow realization that his career was over. Shaw looked at Torres. I'll be filing a full report when I get back to headquarters. Make sure his body cam footage is preserved and logged as evidence. Torres nodded. Yes, sir. Shaw got back into his Lamborghini, started the engine and drove away, leaving Holloway standing on the side of the road with no badge, no weapon, and no future in law enforcement. Chief Dominic Shaw walked into the Parkdale Police Department headquarters 2 hours after leaving Officer Eric Holloway standing on the side of the road. And the first thing he did was call an emergency meeting with the command staff. Within 30 minutes, every sergeant, lieutenant, and captain in the building was sitting in the conference room waiting to hear why the new chief had summoned them with such urgency. Shaw stood at the head of the table with a laptop connected to the projector, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries or introductions. He opened the laptop, pulled up the body cam footage from Holloway's stop, and pressed play. The room went silent as the video showed Holloway approaching the Lamborghini, demanding identification and proof of ownership without stating a reason for the stop, ignoring Shaw's questions about the legal basis for the detention, and then threatening arrest when Shaw refused to step out of the vehicle. The audio captured every word clearly, including Holloway's statement that he was in charge and Shaw's choice was to step out or get arrested. Then the footage showed the search. Shaw's voice on the recording, clear and explicit, stating multiple times that he did not consent to any search. Holloway ignoring him completely and searching the vehicle anyway. The moment when Holloway opened the trunk, pulled out the briefcase, and found his own termination letter. When the video ended, Shaw looked around the table at the faces of his command staff. Some looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked like they had been expecting something like this. Shaw spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made it clear this was not a discussion. Officer Eric Holloway pulled me over this afternoon without a probable cause. He demanded proof of ownership for my vehicle based solely on the fact that I am a black man driving an expensive car. He threatened to arrest me for asserting my Fourth Amendment rights, and he conducted an illegal search after I explicitly refused consent. Everything you just saw is documented on his body cam and on my personal recording. One of the captains, a man named Richard Brennan who had been with the department for 23 years, cleared his throat. Chief, with all due respect, did you set Officer Holloway up? I mean, you were driving that car specifically to see if someone would stop you. Shaw turned to face him directly. I drove a legally owned vehicle through a public street while obeying every traffic law. If that's a setup, then every person in this city is setting up officers every time they leave their house. Holloway had a choice. He could have driven past me. He could have followed me to see if I committed an actual violation. But instead he pulled me over based on bias. And when I asserted my rights, he violated them. That's not a setup. That's a test of whether an officer will follow the law. And Holloway failed. Shaw pulled up another document on the screen. It was Holloway's personnel file, and highlighted in yellow were the 2 prior complaints that had been filed against him over the past 4 years. Complaint 1, Shaw read aloud. Dr. James Patterson, black male, age 41, driving a BMW, stopped by Officer Holloway without cause. Holloway demanded proof of ownership and searched the vehicle without consent. Dr. Patterson filed a formal complaint. The complaint was investigated and dismissed with a verbal warning to Holloway. No further action taken. Shaw moved to the next highlighted section. Complaint 2, Marcus Green, black male, age 37, driving a Mercedes. Stopped by Officer Holloway without cause. Holloway accused him of drug trafficking, detained him for 45 minutes and searched his vehicle without consent. Green filed a complaint. It was investigated and dismissed with another verbal warning. No further action taken. Shaw looked around the table again. 2 complaints, both describing the exact same behavior I experienced today. Both dismissed, and Holloway kept doing it because no one in this department held him accountable. That stops now. Another lieutenant, a woman named Jennifer Reyes, spoke up. Chief, are you terminating him based on this one stop, or are you using the prior complaints as justification? Shaw's answer was immediate and precise. I'm terminating him because he violated the constitutional rights of a citizen today. The prior complaints show that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. A pattern this department documented and ignored. I'm not ignoring it. He closed the laptop and looked at the command staff. I was hired to reform this department. The mayor made it very clear that the community has lost trust in us because officers like Holloway have been allowed to operate without consequences. I've been on the job for 3 days and I've already been stopped 3 times. The first 2 officers backed off when I identified myself. Holloway didn't. He escalated. He violated my rights. And he would have done the same thing to any other black man in that car. The only difference is that I had the authority to hold him accountable. Shaw paused and let that sink in. I'm holding a press conference tomorrow morning. I'm going to show the body cam footage. I'm going to explain why Holloway was terminated. And I'm going to make it very clear that this department will no longer tolerate officers who profile people based on race. If any of you have a problem with that, you can submit your resignation now. No one spoke. The room stayed silent. Shaw picked up his laptop. Meeting adjourned. Get back to work. As the command staff filed out of the conference room, Shaw sat down and opened his email. There was already a message from the police union representative requesting a meeting to discuss Holloway's termination and the possibility of arbitration. Shaw typed a response. Arbitration is Holloway's right under the union contract, but the evidence is clear and the termination will be upheld. If you want to meet, my office is open. He hit send, closed the laptop, and leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow, the whole city would know what had happened, and the message would be clear. Racial profiling would no longer be tolerated in Parkdale. Chief Dominic Shaw held the press conference the next morning at 10 a.m., and every local news station in the city sent reporters and cameras to cover it. Shaw stood at the podium in full uniform with the Parkdale Police Department seal behind him, and he didn't sugarcoat what had happened or try to spin it into something it wasn't. He told the truth. Yesterday afternoon, I was pulled over by Officer Eric Holloway while driving my personal vehicle through District 7. I was obeying all traffic laws. I committed no violations. Officer Holloway stopped me without probable cause, demanded proof of ownership for my vehicle, threatened to arrest me when I asked what I was being arrested for, and then searched my car after I explicitly stated I did not consent. All of this was captured on his body cam, and I'm releasing that footage to the public today. The footage played on the screen behind him, and the room full of reporters watched in silence as Holloway pulled Shaw over, demanded documents, ignored Shaw's questions, threatened arrest, and conducted an illegal search. When the video showed Holloway opening the briefcase and finding his own termination letter, there were audible reactions from the journalists in the room. Shaw continued, Officer Holloway has been terminated effective immediately. His termination is based on his violation of my Fourth Amendment rights, his use of racial profiling as justification for a stop, and a documented pattern of similar behavior over the past 4 years. This department has ignored complaints like this for too long. That ends now. The press conference made national news within hours. The headlines were brutal and accurate. New police chief fires officer who racially profiled him. Cop finds own termination letter after illegal search of chief's car. Bodycam shows officer threatening chief with arrest during unconstitutional stop. Officer Eric Holloway, through his union representative, filed for arbitration claiming wrongful termination and arguing that the stop had been a legitimate use of his discretion. The arbitration hearing took place 6 weeks later, and Holloway's attorney argued that Shaw had entrapped him by deliberately driving an expensive car through a high-crime area to provoke a stop. The arbitrator, a retired judge with 30 years of experience, reviewed the body cam footage, the personnel files showing Holloway's prior complaints and Shaw's testimony. The decision came back 3 days later and was unequivocal. the termination was upheld. The arbitrator's written decision stated that Holloway had conducted a stop without reasonable suspicion, had threatened arrest without legal justification, and had searched a vehicle after being explicitly denied consent. The decision also noted that Holloway's prior complaints showed a clear pattern of racially biased policing that the department had failed to address. Eric Holloway was 33 years old with 7 years of law enforcement experience, and his career was over. He applied to other police departments in neighboring cities, but every background check revealed his termination for constitutional violations and racial profiling. No agency would hire him. He eventually found work in private security, making half of what he had earned as a police officer, and his name remained permanently attached to the case as it was used in police training programs across the country. Chief Dominic Shaw implemented sweeping reforms in the months that followed. Every traffic stop now required officers to document specific reasonable suspicion or probable cause in their reports. Bodycam footage was reviewed randomly and regularly by an independent oversight board. Officers with patterns of stops that disproportionately targeted minorities were flagged for retraining or dismissal. Within the first year, complaints of racial profiling dropped by 68%, and community trust in the department began to slowly rebuild. Shaw identified 8 other officers with complaint patterns similar to Holloway's. 2 were terminated after refusing retraining. 6 were placed on probation and required to complete constitutional policing courses. The message was clear throughout the department. Racial profiling would not be tolerated, and officers who couldn't follow the Constitution would not keep their badges. 5 years later, the Parkdale Police Department is recognized nationally as a model for reform. The stop data shows that racial disparities in traffic stops have decreased by 73%. Community surveys show that trust in the police has improved significantly. Chief Dominic Shaw is still leading the department, still driving his Lamborghini, and still holding officers accountable when they cross the line. Eric Holloway still works in private security. His name is still the first result when you search for examples of racial profiling leading to termination. And the body cam footage of him finding his own termination letter is still shown in police academies as a warning about what happens when officers let bias override the law. The lesson was expensive, public, and permanent. Driving an expensive car while black is not probable cause. Chiefs who test their officers aren't setting traps. They're identifying problems that have been ignored for too long. And officers who can't treat people fairly regardless of race don't deserve to wear a badge. Dominic Shaw never regretted the test. He had identified an officer who was violating rights, and he had removed him before he could harm anyone else. That was his job, and he did it without apology. If you believe a black man should be able to drive his own car without being racially profiled, even by his own officers, share this story. What reforms do you think police departments need to eliminate racial bias in traffic stops? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this reminded you that accountability must start at the top and that chiefs who ignore patterns enable abuse, subscribe. We're not stopping until every officer understands that the Constitution applies to everyone, including the boss. Asterisk.